The British Army of World War II was an institution steeped in centuries of tradition, rigid class divides, and unspoken rules. But how exactly did a man claw his way up from a lowly private in the muddy trenches to a field marshal commanding millions? Today, we are breaking down the complete, historically accurate hierarchy of the British Army during the Second World War. Let's start with the private. This was the absolute bedrock of the British Army. The man carrying the Lee Enfield rifle and the heavy canvas webbing. Interestingly, the title varied wildly depending on the regiment, being known as a gunner in the artillery, a sapper in the engineers, or a rifleman in certain infantry units. They wore absolutely no rank insignia on their battle dress uniforms. A private's daily life was dictated entirely by his non-commissioned officers, enduring endless inspections and brutal combat conditions. This rank formed the vast majority of the casualties suffered by the British Empire across Europe and North Africa. Next is the Lance Corporal. This was the first step onto the non-commissioned officer ladder, denoted by a single white or khaki chevron worn on both upper arms. Historically, this wasn't even considered a full rank, but rather an appointment given to a reliable private to act as a second in command of an infantry section. A Lance Corporal received slightly more pay, but shouldered a disproportionate amount of responsibility under fire. They were expected to take command of the 10-man section if the corporal was killed or wounded. It was often considered the hardest job in the army, stuck directly between the privates and the senior NCOs. Continuing with the corporal, this soldier wore 2 chevrons and was the undisputed commander of the standard 10-man infantry section. The corporal was responsible for the tactical deployment of the crucial Bren light machine gun, the squad's primary source of firepower. He was a fully recognised non-commissioned officer and held significant disciplinary power over the men in his section. Promotion to this rank required proven combat leadership, technical proficiency, and the ability to read a map under stress. In the strict hierarchy of the British military, a corporal was the father figure of the section, responsible for both their lives and their boots. Moving up, we find the sergeant, identified by 3 chevrons worn on the upper arm. This rank commanded the infantry platoon's heavy weapons or acted as the platoon's second in command. Sergeants were seasoned, hardened veterans who formed the disciplinary backbone of the entire British Army. They carried a Thompson or Sten submachine gun instead of a standard rifle, marking their status as close-quarters leaders. In the elite Guards regiments, they were strictly referred to as sergeant with a J, a bizarre historical spelling quirk that was violently enforced. A platoon commander, usually a young officer, relied entirely on his sergeant's practical combat experience to survive. Next, we have the staff sergeant or colour sergeant in the infantry. They wore 3 chevrons topped with a brass crown, marking a significant leap in seniority and administrative power. This rank usually served as the company quartermaster sergeant, controlling the vital flow of ammunition, food, and uniform replacements to the front-line troops. In infantry regiments, the historic title of colour sergeant was retained, a nod to the days when they physically guarded the regimental flags in battle. They rarely participated in direct infantry assaults, instead operating just behind the lines to ensure the combat elements could function. Angering a colour sergeant usually meant you would be eating cold rations for a very long time. Continue with the Warrant Officer Class 3. This was a highly unusual, short-lived rank created just before the war in 1938 and represented by a single crown on the lower sleeve. They were designed to act as platoon commanders, a role traditionally reserved for commissioned officers due to a severe shortage of lieutenants. However, the British Army quickly realised this blurred the strict class lines between officers and men too much. The rank was officially suspended in 1940, making it one of the rarest rank insignias to find on a surviving WW2 uniform. Those who held it were either quietly promoted to officers or reverted to standard sergeant majors. Next is the Warrant Officer Class 2, most commonly holding the appointment of company sergeant major, denoted by a large crown worn on the lower forearm. This man was the senior enlisted soldier in an entire infantry company of around 120 men. He possessed terrifying disciplinary authority and answered directly to the company commander, a major. The company sergeant major did not carry a rifle, usually armed only with a pistol and a pay stick used to measure marching distance. His primary job in combat was to enforce orders, manage the ammunition resupply, and prevent the men from breaking under artillery fire. He was the undisputed god of the parade square and the terror of every junior soldier. Moving to the absolute peak of the enlisted ranks, we have the Warrant officer class, the 1, almost exclusively serving as the Regimental Sergeant Major. This rank wore the Royal Arms crest on their lower sleeves. The Regimental Sergeant Major was the senior-most non-commissioned soldier in a battalion of nearly 1,000 men and was treated with a reverence bordering on fear. Even junior commissioned officers were terrified of this man, who enforced the colonel's will with absolute, uncompromising brutality. They were the ultimate keepers of regimental tradition, ensuring that standards of dress and discipline never slipped, even in the jungles of Burma. To achieve this rank took decades of flawless, ruthless military service. Let's start with the commissioned officers, beginning with the second lieutenant, identified by a single 4-pointed pip on each shoulder epaulet. This was the lowest ranking officer in the British Army. They were usually incredibly young men, fresh out of an officer cadet training unit, placed in command of a 30-man infantry platoon. They suffered absolutely horrific casualty rates during the war, as their job required them to lead from the very front during assaults. Despite their official authority, a smart second lieutenant essentially handed the tactical control of the platoon over to his veteran platoon sergeant. They were affectionately, and sometimes derisively, known as subalterns by the senior staff. Wearing 2 pips on the shoulders, this officer was slightly more experienced and had usually survived his first few months of combat. Lieutenants acted as seasoned platoon commanders or took on specialised roles like the battalion intelligence officer or signals officer. Unlike the Germans or Americans, British officers were heavily drawn from the upper social classes, creating a distinct cultural gap between them and the men they commanded. A lieutenant was expected to project total calmness under fire, an ethos born from the Victorian stiff upper lip. They were armed primarily with a revolver, as carrying a rifle was considered ungentlemanly and distinctly unofficer-like. Continuing with the captain, denoted by 3 pips on the shoulders, the captain was a senior tactical leader, often acting as the second in command of a full infantry company. They were highly experienced officers who had proven their worth on the battlefield and possessed a deep understanding of combined arms tactics. A captain would frequently take command of a company when the major was killed or wounded, coordinating artillery strikes and tank support. In many elite units, like the Commandos or Parachute Regiment, captains led the most dangerous, specialised assault teams. They rode the delicate line between being frontline combatants and administrative planners. Next we have the Major. Wearing a single brass crown on the shoulder, the Major was the undisputed commander of an infantry company, controlling over 120 men. They rode slightly behind the leading assault platoons, usually in a universal carrier or a jeep, directing the broader flow of the battle via radio. The Major was responsible for the strategic deployment of his men, deciding when to commit the reserve platoons and when to call for heavy artillery. This rank marked the transition from a purely tactical frontline fighter to a strategic manager of battlefield assets. In the British Army system, a major was considered a field officer, a distinct step up from the junior subalterns. Moving up, we find the lieutenant colonel. This officer wore a crown over a single pip and was the supreme commander of an entire infantry battalion of roughly 850 men. The colonel, as he was colloquially called, was the absolute father figure of the regiment, dictating its culture, discipline and fighting spirit. He commanded from a mobile tactical headquarters, orchestrating the movements of his 4 rifle companies, mortar platoons and anti-tank guns. A lieutenant colonel rarely fired a weapon in anger, as his primary weapon was the radio network connecting him to brigade command. If a battalion failed an objective, the lieutenant colonel was the man who faced the immediate wrath of the generals. Next is the colonel, identified by a crown over 2 pips. This was a somewhat unusual rank during the Second World War. Rather than commanding troops in the field, full colonels usually held senior administrative staff positions at brigade or divisional headquarters. They were the logistical masterminds, managing the massive supply chains required to keep the frontline battalions fed, armed and fueled. Many regimental colonels were actually honorary titles given to members of the royal family or retired generals, further complicating the British rank structure. On the rare occasion a full colonel was near the front, they were strictly staff officers, not combat commanders. Continuing the Brigadier, wearing a crown over 3 pips arranged in a triangle, this officer commanded an entire brigade consisting of 3 or 4 infantry battalions. Unlike the American system, which used brigadier generals, the British Army considered a brigadier to be the highest field officer rank, not a true general. They were responsible for the lives of over 3,000 men and directed massive coordinated assaults involving tanks, artillery and close air support. A brigadier travelled with a large staff of intelligence and operations officers, constantly analysing maps and aerial photographs. They were the critical link between the grand strategy of the generals and the bloody reality of the battalion commanders. Next, we enter the true general officer ranks with the Major General, denoted by a crossed sword and baton beneath a single pip. This officer commanded a full infantry or armoured division of over 15,000 men. The Major General operated entirely on a strategic level, moving massive formations across whole countries or theatres of war. They rarely saw the front lines, directing the war from sprawling, highly secure headquarters complexes miles behind the fighting. A Major General was responsible for the integration of medical, logistical and combat elements into one cohesive, unstoppable war machine. This was the rank held by famous commanders like Percy Hobart, the eccentric genius behind the specialised D-Day tanks. Moving up, we have the Lieutenant General, wearing a crossed sword and baton beneath a crown. This officer commanded an entire army corps containing 2 or more divisions. A lieutenant general controlled the fate of tens of thousands of soldiers and was responsible for capturing entire cities or holding massive defensive lines. They interacted directly with Allied high command, often negotiating strategy with their American or Soviet counterparts. These men were career soldiers who had usually served in the First World War and understood the horrific mathematics of industrial warfare. The decisions made by a lieutenant general shifted the borders of Europe, identified by a crossed sword and baton beneath a pip and a crown. This was the commander of a numbered field army, such as the famous British 8th Army. They controlled hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks, and entire air armadas. A full general answered only to the supreme commanders and politicians, bearing the ultimate responsibility for the success or failure of entire military campaigns. Men like General Sir Bernard Montgomery held this rank while pushing the Afrika Korps out of Egypt and Libya. They were as much politicians and public figures as they were military strategists, their faces plastered across newspapers back home. Finally, we reached the Field Marshal. This was the absolute highest rank in the British Army, denoted by 2 crossed batons surrounded by a wreath beneath a crown. It was an incredibly rare rank, granted only for extraordinary wartime victories or as an ultimate career honour. A Field Marshal commanded army groups, consisting of multiple armies, and shaped the grand strategy of the entire global conflict. They held the rank for life, remaining on the active duty roster until the day they died. This was the rank of absolute military supremacy, held by legendary figures who dictated the final destruction of the Axis powers. This hierarchy pairs perfectly with an analysis of British infantry weapons, as the rank dictated exactly who carried a Lee Enfield versus a Thompson submachine gun. If you found this breakdown fascinating, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep the history alive.